Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to join your garden club and talk a little bit about outdoor mushroom cultivation. Um, the goal here for me is to really help you feel empowered to grow mushrooms in your home garden or your community garden. It's really a lot easier than I think a lot of people think it is. And it's a pretty easy way to bring fresh, delicious mushrooms to your table without having to spend a whole bunch of money at the farmer's market, which we're glad to spend money at the farmer's market and support our local growers, but you can do it at home too. So without further ado, I just wanted to go over some key terms before we get started. They may come up during my presentation, and I just didn't want people to be confused. So when I say spawn, it essentially is the seeds of your mushrooms. It's generally, and that is mixed with a temporary food source, which is called the substrate. So usually when you'd receive outdoor mushroom spawn, it's going to come in a bag, and it's either going to be in small dowel form or it's going to be in like a sawdust or grain spawn form. And that is your spawn. And that is essentially what you're going to sow to initiate fruiting bodies. Mycelium is essentially the vegetative network of fungi. Think of it as the roots of your mushroom fruits. It's going to be what proliferates through your substrate and colonizes so that it can consume all of the food and create fruiting bodies for your pleasure. Again, the substrate is the media that your mushrooms grow in or on that serves as the food for the mycelium. It's going to come, when you buy your spawn, it's going to come with a temporary amount of substrate. And then hopefully you're going to provide it a more long-term source of substrate that it will continue to feed off of as it proliferates through your growing space. And when I say pinning are essentially the baby mushrooms that appear just before full fruiting. So they're an indicator to say we're on our way and we're about to fruit, so you better not sleep on it because we'll go by before you know it. Colonization is essentially the act of the mycelium proliferating the substrate. I have a picture later in my presentation to kind of show you what that looks like. It's a really good way to monitor the progress of your fungi and how it's coming along essentially. And it can indicate a lot of things. It can indicate whether it needs more water or less water. And it can tell you a lot about the status of your grow. Incubation is the time in which the mycelium colonize the substrate. So it's just that period of time that it takes for there to be an appropriate amount of mycelium in your substrate for it to then want to fruit and create what they call the fruit, the fruiting body of the fungi. That's what you eat. You're familiar with that. That's what you would buy at the farmer's market. And it's the real goal here, right? And finally, a flush is referring to a group of fruiting bodies. And you can have multiple flushes in a season. You can have flushes over many years if you do it right. So those are the major key terms. If any other ones come up, I'll try to explain them as we go. So why grow outdoor mushrooms? Well, there's personal benefits and there's also benefits to your garden and to the environment. So we'll start with the personal benefits. One I already mentioned is the cost savings. They're expensive to purchase retail. Whether you're buying them at Whole Foods or you're buying them at the farmer's market, they're just much more cost effective to grow and they can last a long time. So if you set yourself up right, you could be harvesting fresh mushrooms every summer for a good deal of time. And they're also very versatile. Many varieties can be grown outside and used to cook with. So a lot of the ones that you're probably already familiar with can probably be grown outside. It's fun and educational, right? That's why a lot of you are here. You're looking to learn more, and it's just a fun hobby. It really feels so gratifying to get a big flush of mushrooms. As you can see in this picture here on the right, they're just beautiful, and it's just a lot of fun to engage in such a hobby. It's also fun to experiment with different species and different ways of growing them. There's a lot of different ways to grow mushrooms. We're going to touch on a couple key ones here today, but there's just a lot of ways to do it, and you can mess around with um, different ways to do it and maybe find new ways that work for you. Of course, they're nutrient dense and healthy, as Anne mentioned before. Great source of vitamins, minerals, protein, antioxidants. They're low in calories and fat and cholesterol. They're really a superfood, and they're fresh and delicious when they come out of your garden. Benefits for your garden and the environment. Well, they improve your soil. Fungi are decomposers, as many of you probably know, which break down the organic matter in your soil, such as wood or plant residue, and they leave behind a really nutrient-rich soil. So they're helping your garden while they're growing, and it's kind of a symbiotic relationship that you have with them. They're also a natural waste disposal. You can use garden and food waste such as wood, coffee grounds, straw, leaves as substrate. So you can literally recycle your garden waste and grow mushrooms in it. They enhance your garden. They bring more value to your garden. Mycelium networks are create fungi, improve soil structure, aeration, and water retention. And they also help plants access nutrients better, and nutrients and water more easily. And they can also suppress soil-borne pathogens and root disease. So they really serve you in many ways other than just the fruiting bodies, which you're really looking forward to. You can also maximize your garden space. Some of us only have a finite space to garden in, and there's always gaps in, that you're trying to fill in little spots and make the most of it. And mushrooms really thrive where other plants usually don't, such as the cooler, moister, shadier areas of your garden. So that's a great reason to grow them. And then sustainability in general. Mushrooms grown outdoors require a lot less inputs than indoor mushrooms, which I understand we maybe have some questions about that later, and I'm happy to try to address that. But outdoor mushrooms, there's just far less inorganic waste than indoor cultivation creates. So we'll start with site selection, which is the considerations for both the two different types that we're going to talk about today, which are bed mushroom beds, or incorporating them into your existing garden, and logs, mushroom logs. So you really want to look for a shady microclimate sort of space. You're trying to find like a shady or a filtered sunlight area that's underused for your other veggies that just don't grow very well there. Examples I give here are like bed edges, wood lines, empty spaces between plants, or you can dedicate entire mushroom beds, which you're going to see in my presentation here is kind of how we trial them at the research farm here at Johnny's. You can see in my picture too that this is one of our larger research fields, and if you were to be able to see off to the left, it's a wide open field. We have field trials there every year, and then up towards the top, we have a lot of greenhouses. And this particular spot is pretty much the only shady filtered sunlight spot in this whole field. And so we kind of identified it right away, and you can see the trees that are kind of growing right to the left there, and then they're running parallel on the other side, there's another line of trees. So even when the sun is at its height, it doesn't ever really get full sun there. Nice filtered sunlight. It's a really good spot. And then moisture and drainage is a really big consideration. You want to be sure to choose a spot that can receive plenty of moisture. So nothing that's too sheltered and it's not going to let any moisture in. It can really be the difference between a productive patch and a stalled out one. A lot of the issues I've had with mushrooms stalling out is because it's too dry. And sometimes it's hard to tell if it's too dry or not, but I'll teach you some ways to monitor that as we go too. Be sure to choose a site that drains well, alternately. You don't want waterlogged substrate either. It will inhibit growth and encourage fungus and disease, which are the enemies of the fungus that you want to eat. They will take over. A lot of them are more vigorous than these cultivated fungi species, so you want to watch for that too. And of course, airflow and temperature. You want to really know your hardiness zone. We're here in the range of zone 5 in Maine and New Hampshire. And you want to match the species that you cultivate to match. For example, pink oysters, while they're good as, say, like an annual mushroom, they don't survive cold or freezing temps at all. So you might get a season out of them. But on the other hand, wine caps will, and they'll proliferate for years and years in a cold climate. So you can do a little research to find out what varieties will work or what species will work best for your area. Be sure to choose a spot with ample but not excessive airflow. The idea is to ward off that fungal and bacterial contamination, but also keeping your substrate from drying out too quickly. So it's really a fine line you got to walk there. But once you get the hang of it, it's really not as difficult as maybe I'm making it seem, but it's really not. It's just a balance that you want to strike between too dry and too wet. So as I said, I'm going to discuss logs versus beds. You can do both. You can do one or the other. You can experiment with all of it. They each have their individual pros and cons. Pros of logs are really one of the biggest is long-term production. Certain species with the right kind of wood can fruit for over 3 years. I've seen shiitake plots last 5+ years before they really start to decline in production yields. Um, Another pro is they're really great for shaded woodland edges, as we talked about just before, with natural shade and wind protection. So you can shoe them in odd places in your yard or your garden. Um, it works for premium species such as shiitake, lion's mane, oyster mushrooms. So ones that are really expensive per pound, you can grow really easily in your home garden, which is one of the great benefits. Um, and then proper shading and stacking can help manage airflow and incubation during the incubation period by buffering moisture. You see, I have them stacked, and I'll talk about this a little bit more here, but in this photo, I have them stacked in this kind of log cabin crisscross manner. And I actually ended up moving that pile later and situating them so that they were right up against each other, which is going to add that buffer of moisture and keep them from drying out too quickly, which is something you want to ward against. Some of the downsides to doing logs. It requires cutting logs at the right time of year to ensure the correct moisture and nutrient content. It's not rocket science. It's not that hard, but if you cut them at the wrong time, you're just going to get your mushrooms off to a slow start. But we'll talk about the right times. Inoculation requires tools with logs. So you have to be able to drill holes and then inoculate the either sawdust spawn or plug spawn. So it does require some investment before you can get started. It requires specific log sizes for best results. We'll go a little bit more into that as well. And you may need to soak your logs during extensive dry periods to manage moisture. I know that that's another thing that I think has stalled maybe some of our mushroom trials out is just trying to get them the right amount of moisture. We had a really dry summer last year. And so as you can see, I have drip tape on these beds, and I was out there with a hose spraying stuff down. Soaking them may be a good quick way to do that. And then, of course, a slower first harvest with logs due to longer incubation periods, which is primarily due to the density of that substrate. The wood is a lot more dense than, say, those wood shavings in the background, and so they will take longer to proliferate that substrate. But in the end, it will also take a lot longer for it to eat through that substrate, which is what results in a longer period of harvest. And then for beds, the pros of beds, I mean, they're easy access, watering, maintenance. You can get to them easily. You're out there tending your garden anyway, or you can set them up in an automatic watering fashion like I have here, and make them as low maintenance as you can. They work great in flat, open areas with good moisture retention. There's pretty flexible substrate options here. Depending on the species, you can use wood chips or straw, or you can make mixes of things and layer them together. Um, they're good for species. Beds are really good for species with large seasonal flushes, such as wine caps and oysters. Those are just some of the most easy to grow, and well, at least they make it feel easy because they yield really high and the inputs are relatively low. And they'll do it year after year. I still have oysters that I buried in my garden as compost literally 3 years ago, and they keep coming back and coming back. And I haven't really given them much else. So they're just feeding off the soil and the leftover organic matter from what I grow around them. Some of the cons of beds, they really require regular watering to maintain moisture levels. One of the biggest challenges I had with our test garden here was that water just ran right through that substrate. And so I really had to be on top of watering it so that they wouldn't dry out because that field it's a bit at the top of a hill, so it can get kind of windy there. When it's dry, it just dries them out so fast. They're also more vulnerable to pests as they're right on the ground. So slugs, beetles, rodents, deer, they can all kind of be factors there and potentially damage your end product or your end fruit. But there are ways to deal with that, and they're not as drastic as you might think. It's also more prone to weeds and competing fungi and bacteria. You'll also notice that I have some landscaping fabric laid down there. I've also used newspaper, and I've used cardboard and using a barrier underneath your beds if possible to kind of protect against weeds just makes it easier on you in the long run. And then the seasonal lifespan, they're generally shorter term productivity compared to logs, as we mentioned before, but still a great option. So I'll talk a little bit about preparing beds, and this is based on how we set up our mushroom trials here at the research farm in Maine. So first, you really need to identify the best substrate for the species that you're trying to grow. In most cases, hardwood chips or sawdust, straw, sometimes compost newer wine caps and almond agaricus are favor that type of substrate. You can also use cocoa coir and different agricultural byproducts, like I was talking about earlier, leaves or you know, plant residue left over from your gardens. You really want to avoid conifers, pine, spruce, fir, all those types of trees for most mushroom species. There's a few that they will work with, but none of it is really optimal. And they just have the nutrient and pH balance in conifers is just isn't as compatible with fungi usually. And actually, I'll back up for a second. I'll say here we found a really nice local source, a sawmill that primarily cuts and mills hardwood. So this is pretty much a pile of hardwood shavings. It's a mixed species pile of hardwood shavings, but it's hardwood. So, sometimes you just have to deal with what you have locally and you can't be as picky and choosy as you might like. But we got lucky here and got a really beautiful substrate. So in preparing your beds, the formats that I'm going to discuss here, and there's certainly different ways of doing it. I should have also included here just within your garden spaces. But the formats here are in ground, so that would include in your garden spaces, digging in around your other plants growing in the garden, or as I've done here, raised or mound style beds. This you can also do direct in the ground beds where you would incorporate your substrate maybe with the soil a little bit. Organic matter is often very beneficial for fungi productivity. So, but these are the main types that you would usually think of when you think beds, mushroom beds. So then you come back to incorporating your spawn. You got to use again, I recommend using some type of mulch where possible to reduce the weeds. So if you're creating mushroom beds solely for growing mushrooms, then you have that opportunity where you can line the ground with some type of weed barrier to just inhibit the weed growth a little bit more. A little more difficult if you're doing it in your home garden, but maybe you've already planned for that and you already have some type of weed barrier there. We're also going to discuss what I call what is referred to as the lasagna layering method, which is essentially substrate, spawn, substrate, spawn, substrate until you reach this, a certain depth, which allows the mycelium to really proliferate that substrate. And then best timing for inoculation, ideally the temps are above 50 degrees. So us eager gardeners are sometimes champing at the bit to get our spawn in the garden, but you're not hurting anything. You're only hurting yourself if you try to put them in too early. So wait till after June 1st is usually a good time, at least in our area, to do it, or until temps have stabilized around 50 degrees. And ideally, you don't want to inoculate if it's over 80 degrees. You can, but it's going to get your spawn off to a really slow start. And the mycelium doesn't grow very well when it's too hot or too cold. And so if you hit that 50 to 80 degree range for inoculation, it allows them to establish themselves with milder temperatures so that they can really get going once the temperatures are higher. So a little bit more about this lasagna method. This is how we prepared the beds here at Johnny's. You want to First, you want to get your spawn. So here you see a bag. It's a 5-pound bag of spawn. I'm not sure what species it is. And you want to bust it up because when they pack it, it kind of becomes compacted and is this big cube of sawdust and substrate and mycelium. And so you want to bust it all up and try to make it as fine as you possibly can. It will spread more easily if it's spread more densely across your substrate plane. So the finer you can break it up, the better. I think here we'd had them in the bags a little long, and so the mycelium had really started to grow and made it like an even tougher cube. And so we didn't get to break it up quite as fine as I would have liked, but as much as you can. Usually you can slam it on the ground and beat it around and get some of your aggression out on it, and that'll go a long way to get it to break up as fine as you can get it. But what you see here on the bottom is a pretty good, if you can at least get it to that level, then you're in good shape. And then the next step would be to spread, well, the first step in creating the beds is to spread a layer of substrate. So this is where the lasagna method comes in. You could think of the substrate as your noodles and the spawn as your filling, and you want to get it like an inch layer of substrate down of your, of over your soil or mulch. You can also, again, you can do this right in your garden. You can create little mounds throughout your garden that mimic very small raised beds. So once you've created that landing platform for your spawn, you're going to then take it and as you sprinkle it, you're going to kind of continue to break it up a little bit, and you want to sprinkle it as evenly as possible over the bed. You can do some quick math to kind of figure out how much to use per bed. I think these were, if I'm not mistaken, they're 10-foot beds, and it took about two 5-pound bags. No, they're 8-foot, excuse me. And took about two 5-pound bags to really, I think I overdid it a little bit, but the more spawn you use, especially if you have a lot of substrate, the quicker it will proliferate and the faster you'll see fruiting. So a single 5-pound bag does about a 4x4 space. So if you can kind of use that math and then divide it by the number of layers that you're going to use, you can usually figure out about how much to use per layer. And I put here about a sixth or a fourth of a quarter of a 5-pound bag is a pretty good estimate. It's not rocket science. I mean, you can estimate and it's still going to be fine, but just best practice. The lasagna, sorry, and then the next step would be to add more. So here you go, you're doing your lasagna method. You've added one layer and then substrate, and then here's your other layer. So you're now at about 2 inches of substrate. The spawn itself didn't add a lot of depth, a lot of height to your beds, but you're building your height here every layer you go. Oops, sorry. And then essentially you're going to continue that method until you're either out of spawn or you reach a bed height of about 3 to 6 inches. The deeper the bed, the longer the incubation period, similar to logs. It's denser material, takes longer for the mycelium to proliferate it, but you'll get longer flushes, larger and longer flushes. You'll see here, I think I overdid it a little bit. I built the beds, they're probably more like 8 or 10 inches. And I thought maybe like, yeah, the more substrate, that very thought, like, yeah, the deeper they are, the more mushrooms we'll get. And it took a long time for them to really colonize. So I would stick to that 3 to 6 inches, and you'll see fruiting a lot faster. You can always add more layers later as you maintain your beds. But if you start with like a shallower 3 to 6 inch bed or mound, I think you'll see fruiting a lot sooner. And then you really need to soak them. Right after you create them, you really want to just drench them with water until they're, until it runs out essentially, and really try to soak them as thoroughly as possible. And you want to keep them moist during colonization. So you want to go out and check it and just kind of dig down a little bit. And if it feels dry towards the center of the beds, you want to give it another good soak. Again, it's coming back to that, that happy balance where you don't want them to be waterlogged, but you also don't want them to be dried out. So, find that happy medium. A lot of you are already gardeners, so you kind of, that balance that you strike in your own gardens or with your seedlings. Same concept. And then I'll just talk about a few species that I feel are, really good for beds. Wine caps are maybe the most popular to grow in beds. They're really a beginner level of difficulty. Really easy to grow. They are very prolific. They last for a long time. They are an aggressive colonizer, so they expand really quickly in your substrate. You can expect fruit generally within 6 months. I've seen it in less than 6 months, depending on your weather and the amount of moisture and and the amount of and the species that you're using and the type of substrate you're using. The best substrate for wine caps are hardwood chips and sawdust. Next up would probably be straw. Ideally, you're using chopped straw. You can look up ways to chop it yourself, which is kind of tough. But some places you can buy chopped straw too. You can also use rice or bean hulls. Sometimes you can get those even cheaper than anything else. Or you can use chopped corn stalks, or you can just get creative. But those are some ideas for substrate. Next, also quite easy, are oyster mushrooms. They're a lot of people's favorite mushrooms. They're very accessible to maybe the less adventurous mushroom eater. They have a very meat-like texture. They're very mild, and they just go great with just about anything you cook. They're very adaptable and vigorous, and they're fast to fruit, especially in chips, wood chips or straw. You can expect fruit within 3 months of inoculation with this. It's or sooner. It's remarkably fast. So you do want to keep an eye on things because they will go by if you ignore them for too long. And then you'll be kicking yourself when you get out there and you see a beautiful flush, but it's already all sporulated and really not very edible anymore. When I say oyster, I'm including blue oyster, pink oyster, Italian oyster, black king, black trumpet, and snow oysters. A very popular variety, golden oysters, is I'm not gonna, I would say it's not recommended for outdoor cultivation anymore. Some of you may have heard buzz in the ag community about studies being done showing that golden oysters in particular are an invasive species. So we've kind of introduced them here in the U.S. And they've kind of taken over natural fungi habitats when they're kind of let on their own devices. So we actually dropped golden oysters a while ago just for best sustainability practices. They're good to grow inside, but I would keep them out of your outdoor garden. And also just keep in mind the pink oysters will die under 35 degrees, so they're best either grown in warmer climates or grown annually, or maybe in a greenhouse where we're nice and protected. Best substrate for oysters are chopped straw, followed by hardwood chips and sawdust, and then the other stuff I mentioned, rice and bean hulls, corn stalks, and experiment with substrate. They're very forgiving, and you can probably use a lot of stuff you have laying around. Next, difficulty level intermediate are almond agaricus. This is more like the traditional button mushroom that you might find at the grocery store. They're a little slower growing than the others that I mentioned, and they really prefer warmer weather. So you really want to follow that minimum 50 degree for inoculation. And ideally, you're even inoculating when it's warmer than that. So you could start them a little bit later, maybe the middle of June to the end of June, just to try to get them as the soil or the substrate as warm as possible before you get them in there. Keep these well hydrated. They should fruit within 3 months. They're another pretty quick to fruit, once they're established. But these two will die under 35 degrees without protection. They're a little less susceptible than the pink oyster. So oftentimes in milder climates, maybe not New Hampshire and Maine, but maybe south of us, you can use like a greenhouse or agribon, row cover, or a different type of mulch to try to protect them. And often you can get them to overwinter. In the really cold climates, you might struggle with that. But again, it's worth playing around with it a little bit. Recommended substrate for agaricus, mixed composted manure, straw. It's one of the few species that really likes some additional compost mixed in with the substrate. Also, hardwood leaves or other ag byproducts that I've already mentioned before are possible options. And finally, this is kind of an honorable mention. Lion's mane is, a very interesting and unique type of mushroom. I think traditionally they're not really mentioned as ideal for beds, but I've had pretty decent success growing these in our raised beds on our research farm and even at home. They need to be really closely monitored though, because as they fruit, their harvest window is pretty short. So you see, I tried to get a photo of essentially optimal harvest time, and you're looking for the teeth. They call the teeth the little fractal-like segments of the lion's mane. You're looking for like a quarter of an inch in length there. You can kind of play with it a little bit, but if they start to yellow, they're already gone by or going by. So you want to harvest them when they're really snowy white. They like hardwood chips and sawdust the most, but they'll also grow in straw or rice and bean hulls, corn stalks, other things I've mentioned before. Worth a try. I was skeptical that it would work, and they did, and they're really really a wonderful mushroom. So give it a shot. Just going to have a quick drink here. Some other species to consider. We don't carry all of them, but Namako. chestnut, which is pictured here, really beautiful, interesting, unique mushroom. Blewit mushrooms, as well as Piopinos. All of these are also viable options for beds. So if you get the hang of it, growing some of these other species, you may get adventurous and try some other ones as well. Care and maintenance for your beds, it's pretty minimal, but the number one rule is really don't let your beds dry out. It will stifle your growth and it will slow it down. So it's really critical in the first month or two when that mycelium is proliferating the substrate. But again, you don't want them waterlogged either. Bacteria will flourish and it will box out your mycelium. So just try to keep them consistently moist, but not overwatered. Um, as an option, you can also mulch it after you establish the beds. You can mulch it with straw or additional wood chips or shavings to try to keep moisture in. Or you can tarp them, which is what we actually did with this garden because it was really wet. Was one of the reasons we tarped them, but it ended up working really well to retain the moisture as well. And so we were trying to keep excess moisture out, but it wound up holding moisture in. So it's particularly good for straw beds, which drain really fast. So it's nice to have that additional shelter to kind of keep them from drying out. In the longer term, once they're established, you do want to continue to monitor your moisture levels to maintain that consistent but not excessive moisture. Every once in a while, you want to pull back your substrate layers. You can kind of see that on the top here to check for mycelium growth. It might be, I don't know how big your screen is there, but you can kind of see in that top picture, there's some white, like misty looking, coloration towards the center of that straw. That's your mycelium growing. And that's what you want to see. It takes a little bit of a trained eye to tell the difference between mold and mycelium, but mycelium is almost always pure white. And it's like I said, it's kind of like a network of root-like, almost fibrous strands. And so, it'll grow like that. And if you pull back your substrate and you see that, you're in good shape and you're not far from fruiting. Um, if you do see pins and you've covered your bed, as I described a few minutes ago, this is a good time to remove your mulch, or, pull back some of your mulch or pull your tarp off. You can see the pins here on the bottom left photo. They're very small little baby mushrooms, and they'll start almost microscopic and get a little bigger and a little bigger until they start to really poke out of your substrate and become that larger fruiting body. And that's when you have to really start paying attention for ideal harvest window. And fruiting can take 4 to 6 weeks depending on species, climate, substrate, spawn density. Um, it helps to add fresh substrate every year to kind of continue to feed your fungi. Eventually, it's going to eat through all the substrate you provided it. It may take it a couple years, but if you notice that your flushes have slowed and maybe they're more infrequent or less prolific, you can literally just blend in, usually by hand or maybe with a broad fork, some additional substrate. And you can continue to do that for the life of the beds. And if you do it frequently enough, every year or two, you can continue to get them to fruit because they're going to continue to make mycelium and continue to proliferate if they have enough food to eat. So keep that in mind as you go forward. Um, Again, you can cover or mulch them in cold if you have cold, snowy winters like we do. Um, Using substrate is actually really good for this because it's just more food for them in the spring, a little less that you have to do in the spring. So in the fall, you can kind of tuck them into bed like you do with your garlic and prepare them for a long, cold, snowy winter. Of course, snow acts as an insulator too, but we can't always guarantee we're not going to have a snow-free winter these days. So you could take some steps to kind of buffer it against the cold. It's not always necessary, but it's helpful and it will protect that mycelium from damage throughout the winter. All right, now we're into logs. Um, so I hope I'm not going too rapid fire for everybody, but that's essentially, the do's and don'ts of the beds of making beds. So for logs, the first step really is log selection. The ideal log species that you choose really depends on what species you're growing, but also what's available to you. We have a really nice chart on our website in our growers library called Suitability of Tree Species for growing mushrooms on logs. Real quick, easy to remember name. Um, and it has a whole list of different tree species as they relate and as they're compatible with all the mushroom species that we offer. And so you can get, real specific with it. To the star indicates it's the recommended species, and a check mark is like it's good species. It'll work pretty well for that. Um, some examples are birch, oak, maple, hop hornbeam, beech, basswood. Again, you want to avoid the conifers. They don't tend to work as well or be as productive. And sometimes it just comes down to what you have available to you. You see here, this is a lot of birch. And that's just, I think there's silver birch, and that's just what we had near the research farm. It's one of the most broadly adapted tree species to different species of mushrooms. And instead of going through and trying to identify all these different tree species, we just kind of went with what we had a lot of. So we used birch. So it's okay to, make concessions sometimes. Just try to get it in the right neighborhood of species. So preparing your logs, you can really cut them any time of year except during bud swell and leaf out in the spring. That's when, the tree is drawing all this, it's drawing on its nutrients, it's drawing on its moisture, and it doesn't leave a lot left over for mushrooms. And so really not the best time to cut them, but really any other time of year you can do it. Um, you really only, I mean, this is a hard rule. You only want to cut from living, healthy trees. You do not want to use old, dead logs for mushroom cultivation. You can probably guess that that's because all that other bacteria has already well established itself, and it's going to be an uphill battle for your mycelium to grow within that environment. And it's also going to make your fruits more susceptible to mold and bacteria, and it's just not a good idea. So always use healthy living trees to cut mushroom logs from. The ideal size you're looking for is like 4 to 6 inches. You want to be able to move it around. You see some here that are probably closer to 7 or 8 inches. And man, it was not fun to have to pick them up and put them on a sawhorse while we're drilling holes in them. So, it kind of comes down to the same rule. The denser it is, the longer it will fruit, but the longer it will take to get there. So if you stick to that 4 to 6 inch diameter, they'll fruit more quickly and be more manageable for you. And again, cut them like 3 to 4 feet long. You don't need to make them super long. You want them to be manageable. You can do a bunch of them. And then just the two best times to cut, if you want to try to incorporate it into your annual garden plan. When the leaves on the trees, about a third of them have colored all the way through when they drop. That's a really great time. It's a really great time. And then in the late winter, maybe even this time of year is a great example. Before the buds start to swell and leaf out, is another really great opportunity to cut some, which is when we cut these ones for this particular garden mushroom plot. And then inoculation timing, you really don't want to inoculate any longer than a month maximum after you've cut the logs, because then they start to colonize with that unwanted bacteria and they'll dry out more than you really want them to. You want to capitalize on the moisture that's locked into those logs after you cut them. And you also want to capitalize on the fact that they're not full of foreign bacteria yet. It'll come, it could potentially come eventually, but you want to get your mushrooms a head start, your mycelium a head start, so that it is the predominant species in that log, so that it boxes out other types. So I usually recommend 1 to 2 weeks after cutting. So you can plan it. You can try to plan it, with your, you could order your stuff early, and get it as early as they'll ship it, and then try to get your logs. If you can cut them while it's still freezing, or you have snow on the ground, you can just bury them in snow until you're ready to inoculate, and it will serve the same purpose. Bacteria is not going to grow when it's freezing, and the snow will really help with moisture retention. So preparing the logs does require some tools investment, as I discussed earlier. These include, for sawdust spawn, you want to get a 12 millimeter drill bit. They're a special drill bit that form a really nice circular hole with good depth, and then an 8.5 millimeter drill bit for plugs. It's very specific. Sometimes you can find them cheaper online, or I think the ones that we sell are pretty affordable. Um, you also want to drill to actually drill your holes. But we've also found that an angle grinder, we sell an attachment for an angle grinder if you have one kicking around, and it makes the job just go so much faster. I was skeptical. I was like, why do you need this extra step and this extra tool? But when you're drilling with a hand drill and you've done 20 logs, your arm is dead. And so using something that has a higher RPM, like like an angle grinder with this attachment, it makes it go so fast. It's effortless. So of course, take all safety precautions when using power tools such as that. But I recommend it. If you're finding that your arm is getting dead from drilling them with your regular hand drill, try the angle grinder attachment. It's a dream come true. Um, You'll also need an injector. You see that in the top right, an inoculation injector. That's for sawdust spawn. Um, you want to grab like a hammer or a mallet to knock your plugs in. And then you're going to need sealing wax, whether you're using sawdust or plugs. And of course, I didn't put here, but you're going to need your spawn, and that comes in. We sell two different forms of it: sawdust spawn, which is as it sounds. Mycelium mixed with sawdust substrate. And then the plugs, which are hardwood dowels that have been inoculated with mycelium. And those are the two forms we sell. You're also going to want, I think I mentioned the sealing wax, but also the little dauber wands to put the wax on the logs. They're pretty cheap, and you're going to find you're going to go through them. Once they get caked with wax, there's no really getting them uncaked with wax, and they become more difficult to use over time. So sometimes you have to refresh it if you're doing them any kind of frequently. So we'll go through the steps of inoculating logs. Again, I think this is something that people are often intimidated by, but you shouldn't be. It takes a little bit of overhead work to get started, but it's not really that hard. And if you have some simple tools at home, with supplementing with some of these additional tools, you can get it done pretty fast, and it's very rewarding. So again, you're using that 12 millimeter bit for sawdust, or 8.5 millimeters for plugs. And no matter what you're using, you're going to drill to a depth of about 1 inch. If you get these specialized drill bits, because you could use a drill bit you have at home, certainly, you want to mark it maybe with some tape so that you can make sure to get it in around an inch. Um, that keeps it close enough to the surface, but also close enough to the center to allow it to expand within that wood substrate. And then you're going to create this diamond pattern with holes. You can kind of see it here on the bottom, and you keep them about 4 inches apart, and it will allow lots of different fruiting spaces within the log, and you're kind of making the most of the real estate, so to speak. For inoculation, I mentioned the injector tool. Um, you're gonna, after you've drilled all your holes, you essentially with sawdust, you just jab that thing down into the bag of sawdust spawn, and then you stick it right on the top of the hole, and you plunge the plunger down, and it fills the hole right up. It's a very easy tool to use. It doesn't take a whole lot of accuracy. If you can if you can thin seedlings, you can inoculate a log with a inoculation tool. You can probably do it other ways if you don't want to invest in the tool, but this will be the most efficient way to get the most amount of substrate, or sorry, spawn into your log. Um, and then with plugs, you're just going to place it at the surface of the hole and pound it in until it's just below the surface of the log. You want it to be below the surface of the log and not raised above it, because when you go to wax it, it's going to hold that wax a lot better than if you have it mounded over, which some of them maybe we didn't drill deep enough, and you'd see the plug kind of coming out, and it just makes it tougher to seal. So getting them down below is advantageous. And then the final step in log inoculation is adding the wax over each hole. It really protects the growing spawn from drying out. It also helps it from becoming contaminated from outside sources of bacteria, and just increases your success overall. So, you could probably do it without the wax. It's a tedious activity, kind of a fun activity, but it really will help protect them while it's during incubation. You'll see here that we used a crock pot to kind of warm our wax. I would maybe recommend melting it a different way and then pouring it in your crock pot to maintain it. We melted it in the crock pot. It took a while. So maybe even do it overnight. It took a while to melt the wax down to a usable level. But if you don't want to ruin your crock pot, you might want to go to the thrift store or something and pick up a cheap one, or do what we did here and use a liner to keep it from getting too waxy and unusable for other purposes. But I think we dug this one out of one of our colleagues' basements, and it wasn't being used, and so it was perfect for our purposes. And after you inoculate, you can stack your logs in a pile like you see on the top right here, which is probably the easiest way. It's best to not put them directly on the ground. Again, this is just to ward against unwanted bacteria from growing up and mold and rot as logs do when they're laying on the ground. So if you have a pallet or some pieces of scrap wood kicking around that you can put them on top of, then I would recommend that. You see, I broke my own rule here. I don't actually have them on pallets or on wood strapping or anything. We worked with what we had. And you see then after they've colonized and you can tell that they've definitely the mycelium has spread throughout the log. You can then separate them, like you see here on the top left. Again, if you're going to stack them, I recommend stacking them against each other. It will help hold moisture in. They'll dry out faster if they're stacked like that. But once they're colonized, you don't necessarily need them to be stacked so close together. You may have to, add some moisture if things get too dry, but you'll also see that you can lean them against the structure. I have some experimental ones leaned up against the fence here. I've also seen them leaned up against a barn or a wall on your property or different type of fence. And that's one way to do it. Again, I would keep them right up next to each other while they're colonizing to try to hold moisture in. And then after inoculation, specifically for logs, fruiting time really is going to depend on multiple factors. Your species, your size of logs, the conditions in which they're being raised in. A standard log, like I mentioned earlier, that 4 to 6 inches by 3 to 4 feet long, in a temperate climate, is usually about a year to colonization. So you do have to be more patient with logs, and they take some monitoring throughout that process. But smaller logs, as I mentioned earlier, they'll fruit sooner, but they won't fruit for as long. So you can certainly use smaller logs. You can experiment with different sizes and see what you like the best and what works best for you. Cooler weather and ample moisture will shorten incubation time. So like I said earlier, if it's really hot, it's going to slow that mycelium growth a lot. So doing it in the cooler part of the summer, or some people even inoculate in the fall with more winter hardy types. But it's best to do it in the cool, not too hot part of the spring, so that they're already well incubated or already well colonized by the time the temperatures start to get up into the 80s. Under some conditions, not always, logs can take up to 24 months to fruit. Really depends on species, and often it's much more of an environmental or moisture factor than anything else. So if you provide them with the ideal conditions the best you can, you should see them fruit in a shorter amount of time. But if you still haven't seen them fruit after 12 to 16 months, don't give up on them yet, because they're probably still coming. They're just taking longer. And definitely log size will extend the amount of time it takes for them to colonize. Again, you want to maintain that consistent moisture. I know I sound like a broken record, but it really is the secret to success in my experience. Same concept as beds. You want that regular moisture, but not waterlogged. And if you're receiving regular rainfall, you probably don't need to supplement with extra water. So if we have a nice rainy summer where it rains once or twice a week, then you're probably good to go and you don't really need to add water. You can look up different methods for auto watering. You kind of saw what I did there with the drip tape on the beds. We also ended up, because they were drying out so fast, we added some upright sprinklers that they were on a swivel mechanism, and they they spread a really nice amount of water over our beds and the logs. So you could do something like that, or you can just hit it with a hose if you're looking for some, uh, some meditative activities after you get home from work. You can stand out there with a hose and do it too. It's really especially important during that dry, droughty weather. Last summer was a great example of that. It can be done. You just have to be, more on top of making sure they stay watered, like with any other plant that you're growing in your garden. And then species selection for logs. I want to just go over some of the favorites and some of the my highest recommendations. Shiitake are probably the most widely grown in logs. Of course, they're a wonderful mushroom. They're delicious and beautiful, and you can dry them and keep them for a long time. They can pretty much be grown on using any different log or wood method. They can be slower to fruit, but traditionally they will fruit for a long time. I have logs at home that have been fruiting for 4 years, and I expect them to do so again this summer. Maybe it'll decline after a while, and then it's time to inoculate some new logs, but they'll last a long time. Best species for shiitake are alder, beech, hop hornbeam, or just regular hornbeam, maple, oak, and sweet gum. There are other species that will work as well. Again, I've done it in birch, and that works pretty well. But these will be the ones that get you to success the fastest. And then oysters again. Here they are again. They're great in beds. They're great on logs. This obviously is not a picture of them coming out of a log, but they're very adaptable. They're very vigorous. They're fast to fruit compared to other species. They can fruit anywhere from 3 to 6 months after inoculation, probably closer to 6 in logs, just because of what we've already covered. The best species for logs are blue, pink, Italian, and snow oysters. Again, I wouldn't recommend cultivating golden oysters if you're looking to cut down on invasive species, because it does look like it's becoming a problem in North America. And recommended the species for oysters are aspen, cottonwood, tulip tree, willow, alder, birch, elm, or maple. I mean, and again, there are others that will work with it. You see, it's got a pretty wide spectrum of species that it will work well for it. They're very, very user friendly. And then lion's mane again. It can also be used growing. This is more of an intermediate level, I think, mostly because of its short harvest window. You want to really stay on top of it, but it can be grown on just about any wood method. I'll describe a few here at the end that are alternate to logs. They fruit best during cooler weather periods, so you may see them fruit more towards the fall. But they need to be closely monitored, especially after you see pinning, because the ideal harvest window is short. So look for fruit around 6 months after you inoculate. I've inoculated in the spring, and I've had flushes before the frost. So keep an eye on that. They'll also overwinter, to a great degree. You can protect them to ensure that, but they'll overwinter, for the most part. Beech, hornworm, sorry, not hornworm, hornbeam, maple, alder, birch, walnut, elm, oak. They're pretty broad spectrum. They work with a lot of different species of wood. And then just some honorable mention species to consider. Again, chestnuts, Namako, which you see here, reishi, which is another beautiful, very exotic mushroom, and also hen of the woods and chicken of the woods. Things that you might find in your backyard forest, you can cultivate. And then mushroom foraging is a lot of fun, but it's even more fun to walk into your backyard and have a big flush of mushrooms and go back to your meal. So some other methods, that you may want to consider maybe after trying these two methods that we discussed today, are stump growing. Essentially, this is just inoculating a freshly cut stump. It'll extend your harvest window even longer than logs, mainly because of the density, which also can extend the incubation time. And then there's the totem method, which is essentially two logs stacked together. I wish I had a picture over here, but it's like two logs stacked together, and then you essentially sandwich sawdust spawn in between the two stacks, and they'll fruit out from under it, and then the mycelium will go up and down as as they become, as the log kind of starts to deteriorate. And it's another really interesting and fun way to grow. There's also, you'll read about trenching and burying logs, and you can place them in kind of pre-dug trenches. This is like a moisture retention technique, and it kind of lessens that maintenance we talked about earlier with watering and setting up irrigation and all that. It can be a good way to retain moisture. And then also buckets, which you see pictured here. They're similar to the raised bed idea. You want to use the same lasagna method. It's essentially all the things that apply to beds apply to buckets. It's just a smaller scale. They're great for small spaces or filling in empty ones, or if you don't have a huge, if you just have a patio or a fire escape if you live in the city or something like that, they're a great option for that. And you pretty much drill them like logs and you fill them like beds. You're going to do that same diamond shaped pattern all over the bucket. You're going to fill it via the lasagna method, and then you get these beautiful flushes coming out of the buckets like this. Those are not as long as you might expect. They're probably the shortest harvest duration because it just eats through that substrate pretty fast, but you can renew it easily enough. And then just some harvesting tips. For tools, you really want to use a sharp, clean knife so you can slice them at the base just above the surface of the soil. You want to try to get the cleanest mushroom possible. They're going to grow out and they're going to look pretty clean unless it rains and gets dirt all over them. And the cutting them with a clean knife is going to keep them, hopefully you're eating them pretty soon after you harvest. But if you have to keep them in the fridge for a few days, if you cut them with a dirty knife, they're more likely to go south faster. Nice to have a soft bristled brush. Sometimes you can even get a knife with a bristle brush on one end, a specialty mushroom knife, and that just helps you clean off any dirt or debris that may have clung to your mushrooms during fruiting. And then I like to have a basket, a nice little harvest basket. It's easy to collect them that way. They're kind of minimize damage as you're harvesting a big flush of mushrooms. So find a good vessel that you can harvest into. You don't really want to fill like a bulb crate full of mushrooms. They'll start to crush each other, and so smaller flushes, grab a basket. And some tips for identifying when they're ready. This is maybe a question I get the most, like how do I tell when it's ready? Well, as I've talked about before, clusters of mushrooms grow very quickly, mind-blowingly quickly in some cases, especially in a setting like beds where you're kind of doing other stuff and you're checking your beds every once in a while. Before you know it, you see pins, and it's only within a day or two that your fruits are going to be big enough to harvest. So you want to, the best rule of thumb is to harvest just before the caps begin to flatten out. For lion's mane, it's a little different because it's got those teeth we talked about earlier that you're looking for that like quarter of an inch to a half an inch long, and before they begin to yellow. But with most other mushrooms that have a cap, you want it to be nice and rounded over. You can see that in these top two here. That top left oyster is munched by something a little bit, but ignore that. And you see that nice curve to the crown of the cap. That is like perfect harvest state. And then this wine cap on the right here, it might be getting like almost close to peak harvest, but you can see that cap is still nicely rounded over. It hasn't started to flare out yet or flatten out at all. And if you were to flip it over, you'd see the gills underneath are a lilac-y purple, which are a nice indication that they're perfect to harvest. Over mature mushrooms are going to happen, and they're still edible, so you can kind of feel out how over mature they are, but they get pretty funky after they start to sporulate, and they also have a shorter shelf life and are much more easily damaged. So, test your hand. I'd say harvesting a little early is probably better than harvesting late, because at least then you can still eat it, and then you can be like, all right, next time I can wait a little bit longer and maybe get my mushrooms a little bit bigger. So just quickly touching on pests and diseases, of course they exist, as with any other crop that you're growing. With mold, it can grow on the plugs if your packaging is damaged in transit or on harvested fruits that have been stored for too long. It's good to store them in like a paper bag so it can breathe a little bit. You probably know that from just keeping regular mushrooms in your home. But do not eat moldy mushrooms. It's not worth it. You're going to make yourself sick, and it's just not. Keep healthy mushrooms. If they go moldy, just toss them back into your compost, and you can use them again to grow mushrooms later. Slugs and snails love mushrooms. You can sprinkle a little diatomaceous earth around the base of your planting, either your beds or your logs, to combat them naturally. You don't really want to spray anything, even organic approved substances on your mushrooms, because you want them to be as pure as possible. So I would stay away from spraying or using any type of insect control that way. But diatomaceous earth isn't going to hurt anything, and you can sprinkle it around your plantings, and it will help slow their travel at least. You can also use other natural techniques for controlling slugs and snails. The beer can method works pretty well, or yeah, there are other ways to do it. And then mammals. Certainly, we live in the Northeast, so there's plenty of deer and other critters that are parading around in the evening. And they might eat some of, but usually not all of your flush. The mammals really aren't as interested in the mushrooms as they are your fruiting crops. You can protect them with fencing or covering them up with like row fabric, but mostly they just disturb the bed. I pictured that here at the bottom here. You can kind of see the hoof prints from the deer that get into our back field over a fence. I'm not sure how they get in there, but they do, and they root around a little bit. But worst case scenario, you just kind of pile your substrate back together, and it's not a big deal. And finally, just some words of caution. Ensure your mushrooms are cooked thoroughly before you eat them. This probably goes without saying. And if you're eating a species for the first time that you haven't tried, start with a small amount, just to test for if you have any allergies or adverse effects from it. Most of these cultivated domestic mushrooms are not going to make you sick, but people have different body chemistries, and I know some people who can't really eat chestnut mushrooms because they make their bellies, feel sick. They don't bother me at all. So, it's just something where you want to experiment if you're trying something new, just to make sure it agrees with you. Um, of course, logs grown outside have a higher risk of being colonized by other fungal species. So maybe that's one of the cons, like we discussed earlier. But just keep that in mind. And look, inspect your mushrooms when you harvest them to make sure they don't have a bunch of funky stuff on them. You can see here my colleague Brenna's holding this beautiful flush of pink oyster, and they're just gorgeous. They're clean. You can tell that they're ready to eat. And then make sure to confidently identify mushroom species before consumption. Most of the time, it's going to be easy. You cultivated pink oyster, they came out like this. You can easily tell that they're what you grew. But a fruiting body could be of a local species. If it's ambiguous, double check before you consume it, just to be safe. Well, that's what I have for outdoor mushroom production on a home garden scale. It's scalable to some degree if you're a market gardener. I've seen a lot of growers do the log method on a pretty large scale, so they can bring shiitake and lion's mane and oyster to market. It takes a little more investment and time to do it on a larger scale, but they're really perfectly suited for the home garden and for the community garden. So experiment, have fun. And thanks a lot. I appreciate you listening to my spiel today.